Good afternoon, everyone. And a very good afternoon to everyone, and thank you for joining us at this conference. I bid you a very warm welcome to AHI. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you most cordially at this conference, Space and Place, organized by the Arts and Humanities Initiative, Mellon Grant at UB. This event is the culmination of collective effort. I should like to take this opportunity to express my appreciation to Provost Ahmad Dalal for the enthusiasm he gave to generating the concept of the initiative itself, negotiating it with the Mellon Foundation, and supporting it with much rigor. Due to Senate meetings this afternoon, Provost Dalal will not be able to join us. He sends his warm regards and wishes and will try to attend tomorrow. One of the main objectives of this conference is to try to bring together a group of scholars who are working on the Middle East on the topics of space and place and their interrelations in various modern and classical cultural, social, and intellectual contexts, aiming to initiate interdisciplinary debates, mainly in the arts and humanities, on which we all can build on for the future. Here, encounters between literary critics, sociologists, anthropologists, and scholars from other disciplines would carry fruits for a deeper and more differentiated understanding of the micro level of Levantine societies and cultures. The interrelationship between the more abstract concept of space and the geographic anthropological place as locus of bodily and cultural experience is complex and multi-faceted. Both phenomenon and the theoretical configurations have their own intellectual histories within variegated fields of inquiry. They have been expanded and conceptually represented in philosophy, cultural studies, anthropology and sociology, architecture and art theories, space, place, and locale, where the social elements interact through thought and memory. All these form fundamental notions to discern the trajectories taken in modern research in approaching nearly every physical, ontological, religious, and geographic aspect of spatial and topological relations, dynamics of power, visibility, communal life, as well as narrated spatiality in the novel or any oral narration as well. These are themes that address place, which is inhibited space, as well as structural aspect of space, spatiality as such. In considering how these structural aspects relate to the body and geometrical space, and at the same time move from being a mere collection of coordinates into a meaningful, lived-in space, we necessarily need to include, among other dimensions, those of oral history and science of memory, with the overlapping meaning simultaneously embodying physical, emotional, metaphysical references. To borrow from Homi Bhabha, if at all appropriate to borrow from such an intricate thinker, I'm quoting, space should be problematized within the cultural politics of postmodernity, at the same time post-colonial situations, by referring to many kinds of expressive cultures, let alone literatures. End of it. Location is more than mere place or site. It includes the traces and trajectories of belonging and of the more or less forced and also spontaneous traveling and moving. Perhaps the most glaring illustration of a contested location is Palestine. One of the first aims of Zionism was to reproduce new social, religious, and cultural meanings of spaces in the geography of Palestine. in order to create new identities for the multitude of nations that came to colonize and live in the land, and to emphasize the connection between the people of Israel and the land of Israel. Power here is expressed by monopolizing and recreating space, not only to shape a new identity, but moreover as a process of domination aiming at relegating and at the exclusion of the natives. Not everyone is in the same place. The place, and accordingly the space of the native, has been destroyed, and a new power has taken over. There are various methodological approaches on how to map living physical spaces of encounter from a plethora of perspectives: homes, cities, gardens, borders, ruins, as well as all assortment of texts, literary texts. Allow me to mention some intriguing examples in the field to which I belong, classical Islamic studies and narratology. Zaideh Antrim, in her book Roots and Realms, The Power of Place in Early Islamic Work, 2012, studied the concept of al-hanin, longing for home, and the concept of the homeland as an object of desire and belonging. She also showed how medieval Muslims understood the world to be divided into regions, subscribed to climatic divisions, iqlim or aqalim, in which natural, ethnographic, and historical determinants define specific territories in precise ways. Another approach to space comes from the study of literary texts. With the students whom I encounter in the courses that we meet together, we study the representation of space in classical Arabic literature, the maqama, the Arabian Nights, popular folk tales, historical narratives, as well as modern Arabic narratives. We map together the living and the imaginative spaces, the spaces of minorities, of city culture, of peripheries, and of crossing boundaries, definitely. Usually, we follow three-layer schemata in our attempt to decipher the texts. At first level, a topographical level, space as a static entity. The second is a chronotopic level, the structure imposed on space by events and movements that are within the text. The third, a textual level, the structure imposed on space by the fact that it is signified within the verbal text. The idea of border and borderland is also a theme that keeps us occupied in these sessions, in these classes. A theme which has been expanded in cultural studies, anthropology, and sociology to include nearly every psychic or geographic space about which problems of boundary and limit can be thematized. This approach suggests that boundary crossing and boundary shifting are central to social negotiations as well as to reproducing space symbolic boundaries. Dean McGreevy, in his keynote speech, will tackle how geographers, I suppose, understood places and investigate the situation of the individual, violation of boundaries, whether boundaries of the body, of the house, or the cultural, political domain. This is his field, and he's written 2 books in this field, American Studies, but basically geography, boundaries, and general aspect of space. For those of us who still have hope, Professor Walid Sadiq will attempt in his keynote speech to read The Ruin differently. Rather than being an exercise in nostalgia and in fear, destruction and the ruins are possibly reminiscent of a former grandeur and or an intimate memory of dwelling and of human interventions. Of course, some ruins still contain objects, physical, actual objects, detritus, and decorations that bear testimony to a history of inhabitation. Ruins often serve as an apt metaphor for the poetics of pleasure in decoding the remains as a locus of sentimentality and or as a chronotope of a memory schemata. Walid Sadiq is proposing to approach the ruin as forthcoming, as opening a space-time to come, not from an unperceived and hopeful future, but rather a space-time that is built by survivors, those usually slighted by projects of post-war reconstruction. I think the theme of the ruin is becoming very important and actual in our lives after the Lebanese Civil War, and now we see Syria in ruins as well. It is thanks to Professor Samir Khalaf that the concepts of space was introduced at AUB in the mid-90s of the last century when I joined AUB. And I think when Professor Khalaf came back from Princeton to Beirut, he changed our intellectual and academic life at AUB. He too brought Mellon Grants to encourage graduate students and faculty back in the 90s, organized workshops and conferences, and encouraged all of us, students and faculty alike, with great enthusiasm. Observing the Arab world today in throes of the revolutionary changes that are burgeoning and opening way to radical changes on all levels, I cannot but think of Professor Khalaf's perceptive insight that foresaw the significance of public spaces as loci of change and of intifada, as he writes, resulting in a form of disorder which would allow spaces for diversification. In his 7th or 8th book, I think, Heart of Beirut, 2006, Khalaf studied the role of the Saha, the Maidan, not only in its role in urban redevelopment Beirut, post-war Beirut, as rare and challenging interludes for urban designers, but moreover, he read its dynamic role as a space for the youth and the marginalized in their endeavor to invigorate change and offer rare opportunities to reclaim a measure of freedom and spontaneity within the enclosure of the city and the authoritarian regimes. The regime of the city was talking about Beirut. Observing the Arab world today in the throes of the revolution changes, Khalaf's sociological insights will certainly inform the conference papers to seek perspectives that go beyond the here and now of the Maidan point of view. This was only a short summary of some of the themes that will be addressed in this conference, basically by the 3 keynote speakers. Allow me now to express gratitude to all our colleagues whose contribution was indispensable to materialize our coming together in this conference. I would like to extend my warmest thanks to the administrative assistants at AHI, Mrs. Rita Vasil, you all know her by now. Without her enormous efforts, patience, kind help and support, her smile, even during her maternity leave, and welcome to Naya as well.
Thank you.
So without all these efforts, we wouldn't have accomplished anything, and we wouldn't have a chance to meet together. Thanks are also due to the student assistants, Nadine Nakab and Crystal Babikian, and to the ushers today, Muhammad and Abdullah. Commander help was essential. Nadia Abu Ali and Samir Mahmoud, the 2 postdoctorate fellows who joined us this year and who's done a formidable job on all levels, organizing and on the intellectual level, by the way. I thank them, all of us, I think, thank them for helping us prepare this conference ideas, working sessions, preparing workshops, and you say. Samir is going to, I'm not to introduce you, Samir is going to introduce Professor Khalaf, who's giving the first keynote speech. The last section is about our coordination, collaboration with the American University in Cairo. Perhaps Dean McGreevy can tell us more about this. This conference establishes also the first step on the long way of a mutual relationship and academic collaboration with the American University in Cairo. Thanks again to the efforts of Dean Bordage of the American University in Cairo, Dean Patrick McGreevy of the American University of Beirut, Provost Dalal of the American University of Beirut, who have started the ideas. We had different sessions, more than one session, working together, and we will start. So this is the first fruit of Dr. Hakim Aristo joined us from AUC. His other colleague, Dr. Ananya Chakravarti, was unfortunately unable to join us today due to residency permit in Cairo. So both of them were supposed, Hakim now joined us. He is going to chair the session and of course comment on the session, and it's a chance for all of us to start interaction with AUC. We hope in the future to open this interaction collaboration among other investors in the area, not necessarily always to look at the West Europe, and we should do that, but it's high time that we start collaboration among our universities here. Thank you very much to everyone, and Samir, please, it's your time. Thank you.
Before I officially introduce Professor Khalaf, a few introductory remarks in regards to the conference itself and some of the ideas addressed in the conference. Let me start from the outset by doing the very difficult and controversial thing of defining the two words space and place, which may be used as a point of reference or point of contention throughout the conference. And I'm borrowing here an apt definition from Casey. Space, he defines as the encompassing volumetric void in which things, including human beings, are positioned. And place is to be defined as the immediate environment of my lived body, an arena of action that is at once physical, historical, social, and cultural. Now, one can certainly think of any number of reasons why philosophers throughout the centuries occupied themselves with the topic of place. One think of Cora, Topos, Templum, not to mention a wide variety of non-Western categories that have yet to be mined by scholars. What do Arabic and Islamic philosophers have to say? Is there an accurate one-to-one translation of word, space, and place? That's beyond perhaps the purview of this conference, but a topic worth investigating indeed. However, to raise the question of place today is to return to the very important and crucial issue of modernity. Investigations of place invariably derive from a certain kind of urgency, a fundamental problematic at the heart of modernity. And with that, an advocacy. Philosophers, literary critics, anthropologists, sociologists, journalists, all sorts of writers and intellectuals often write about place in order to ally themselves with it. Ally themselves with it as opposed to space or time or other categories. And the first, most obvious example that jumps to mind is Heidegger's reflections on dwelling. And here, this is my own architectural bias coming through here. His notions and reflections on dwelling come to mind, and his maxim that we do not dwell because we build, but rather we build because we dwell comes to mind. Therefore, in the past 2 centuries, or 1 century, in fact, to embrace space has meant to mount a resistance against the abstract character of modern life, which has led to the creation of built environments that betray no context, scorn local history, scoff tradition, disregard indigenous aesthetic taste in favor of the artifice of linear lines and the gratifying order of logic. As a result, the 20th century has become a hodgepodge of objects suspended in space, a cacophony of discordant tones. Sometimes a place as concrete as Gezi Park, for example, in Istanbul, becomes a site of such powerful resistance to all sorts of global forces. And I think Wilson Diaghici will show this and demonstrate it in quite depth. Under the banner of place, then, a battle is fought. A battle against the leveling and universalizing tendencies of modern life. And this makes sense given that the historical development in the early modern sciences and the arts led to the positioning of infinite and homogeneous space-time as a reference point or axis on which natural events and human experiences are plotted. Christa Benz will eloquently allude to the various types of perspective, newspaper, value, spatial, reverse, and central perspective, and in relation to the modalities of vision and control, also referring, I believe, to the panopticon in the Enlightenment period. To give an example from architecture, an aerial view of an old townscape, a medieval city, or the older quarters of many a Middle Eastern city, reveal prima facie an image of disorder and chaos that bewilders the modern mind. Streets, lanes, and passages intersect at varying angles, twist and turn haphazardly, and end abruptly with no seeming rationale. What definition there is to the city is defined by its imposing perimeter walls, especially when defense requires it, the jostling marketplace, and the central authority, be it the palace, the main cathedral, or the mosque in the case of a Middle Eastern city. However, the fact that the city layout is with no apparent geometric grid does not mean that it was not legible. Much like a local dialect or language, it was perfectly understandable to those who use it every day, those who trod its paved streets and lived its daily dramas. For a traveller passing through it, it may well have seemed like a maze. The old cityscape, it seemed, privileged local knowledge over outside knowledge. Historically speaking, the incomprehensibility of the city to outside invaders provided a margin of political clout and safety from outside control. It allowed an intricate and complex web of political resistance to thrive until time was ripe for rebellion. Was it not the Kasbah of Algiers and the Bazaar of Iran that helped bring down the French in Algeria and the British in Iran? Illegibility to outsiders, it seems, has been a guarantor of political autonomy. Just as the cobbled streets of an old townscape guaranteed political autonomy for its inhabitants, so the imposition of legible linear grids over the old cities was a way to facilitate policing and control. Therefore, to be modern, that is to give up the sense of place associated with the late medieval hierarchical world. That is the world of Dante or Miranda, for that matter, where, to use Heidegger's apt expression, bare space is still veiled over. Bare space is still veiled over. Because space has already been split up into places, into meaningful places. To be modern is to give up this notion of sense of place in favor of a space and time conceived to be populated by an infinite number of entirely exchangeable loci. On a recent trip of students a few days ago to Rome and Florence, I took a number of my students, and what was quite remarkable is the way they describe these cities as opposed to describing the places they're familiar with. And just to throw out a few descriptions, Rome was described as a living idea, Siena as having a heart, and the Villa Lante, a Mannerist villa in the countryside, described as a journey of the self. And as much as I try to convince my students or try to really urge them to find a space or place they are familiar with that they can describe quite equally meaningful, they couldn't come up with a description for a place like in Beirut, for example. Defending the concrete and the particular, as opposed to the abstract and the general of this Newtonian universe, the thinking about place has now become enlisted in an interdisciplinary assault on the modern. Even the living memory of what once becomes a potent force in this struggle. For example, Maria Bashir Al-Nasser shows in her piece on Ras Beirut, and also Joseph Farage clearly demonstrates of the post-colonial situation of Palestinians in exile by drawing on Bakhtin's notion of the chronotype, i.e. the inseparability of time and space. But why should place in particular be such a rallying call for such a struggle against the moment? After all, the history of thought, especially 20th century critical thought, has marshaled any number of philosophical sites and categories. The id, the unconscious, the sensuous, the particular, all are valid philosophical sites for critique. There's something unique, perhaps, about place. Place is significantly different from other sites that's mentioned, for it uniquely engages the questions of critique, power, and knowledge. Place has something about it of a universal precondition. We can understand this in the Kantian sense of a precondition for human experience, or better yet, the pre-Socratic philosopher Archytas captured this when he stated that place is the first of all things, since all things exist, all existing things, are either in place or not without place. Ibn Arabi's meditation on the mim kaf noon in the word makan suggests that place indeed is nothing but the primordial latent power of something being or existing or appearing. Place also provides a very unique point of access to interrogate what Edward Casey calls the human subject who is oriented and situated in place. A point that has often been neglected in Western philosophical theories of human selfhood, which tends to dissociate the notion of identity from place and associates it only with consciousness or detached consciousness. While Locke and Descartes may receive the brunt of Casey's critique, it is the legacy they have bequeathed to modernity that is most disturbing. Past Locke, Descartes, and the moderns, Casey provides us with a phenomenological maxim: no place without self, and no self without place, or what he calls the constitutive co-ingredients between self and place. Each is essential to the being of the other. With this in mind, let me come back to the impersonal nature of modern cities. From time immemorial, human beings have experienced the environment as meaningful, and this happens only when spaces become places. One therefore could define place as a meaningful space. Meaningful spaces or places emerge only in full knowledge of tradition, vernacular, folklore, context, culture, history, symbols, polity, economy, climate, but most importantly in the context of our discussion of Casey, self. It is only when one is fully immersed in and saturated by all of the above elements that one becomes truly capable, through the use of more technical skills, technique, of creating positive built environment, or what Heidegger calls a dwelling. Only such a holistic and broad view of the built environment in its complexity can generate a livable, built environment where human beings can once again live. Back to my students, who insisted that the disparity between the beauty and appeal of the traditional townscape they saw in Italy and the more impoverished modern cities is a living testimony to a bifurcation: subject, object, rational, irrational, etc. Many, not all pre-modern cities, possess a quality primarily in the realm of feeling that makes us flock to and imitate them, wherein these dichotomies are as immediately felt, or are not as immediately felt, or at least are in the background anchoring the event. One only has to mention cities like Rome, Venice, Florence, Siena, Fez, and many other cities. The pleasures we get when visiting these places, to quote, are increased more than half with acquaintance. And this is due to a feeling of being in tune to something. And it goes back to the question of the problematic of modernity. Somehow something is lacking. It seems as though the physical structures themselves are the embodiment of something entirely human. These places are thick places where self and place are somehow deeply enmeshed, and where this mutual imbrication is still felt and perceived even when the original inhabitants have long been dead. Qualities that are painfully lacking in today's developer and profit-driven structures. One of the questions that one of the students asked, quite interestingly, is if self and place are intimately enmeshed, in today's world where we're not so familiar with the medieval self, if you want to call it, a medieval culture, why do we still find ourselves at home in these particular places? It raises an interesting question. I wasn't able to answer, to be honest with you, and I looked like a fool in front of my own students, because most of the time I was answering almost every single question. But if anyone does have a response to that, it would be very interested to hear. Of course, on the question of the particularity of place and its relation to self, one has to invoke the diversity of cultures. Perhaps much work has yet to be done, particularly from non-Western philosophical traditions. Of particular significance in this conference, perhaps, are the attempts to delineate an indigenous philosophical intellectual discussion from within the Arab Islamic tradition itself, such as the notion of athar in Ibn Khaldun by Maha Abdul Majid, and the discussion surrounding Muqaddasi or Maqdisi and Yaquthi by Claude France. But also one can recall here the Fada'il literature, stemming from the Quran and Hadith all the way down to Ibn Asakir and Suyuti. And one can easily contrast that with the notion of sacred space and profane space in Eliade, and whether that actually applies or not. Is the construction of sacred space, is there such a thing as a profane and sacred, according to Eliade's notion of homo religiosus, or is the construction of the sacred in medieval Arabic culture something entirely different, with no clear boundary between the sacred and the profane? Alas, in our times of the erosion of local cultures, what Casey calls the scattered self of modernity and postmodernity, the unhinged self as they are because it's unhinged from particular locales because of the internet, or what R.D. calls globalization, i.e. that a global city becomes as present as a local city, and vice versa, creates what R.D. calls thinned out places, wherein, I quote, the densely enmeshed infrastructures of self and place are missing. The densely enmeshed infrastructures of self and place are missing. Example of the web and the internet, where you flick through various kinds of channels and internet virtual realities, leading to what Casey calls the fickle self, in reference to the aesthetic self in Kirkukai, a self that's purely out there to be entertained. Some, from Schiller to Heidegger, the Monoponty, especially their ruminations on Cézanne, philosophers have often invoked art as a means of healing the cleavage opened up by the modern. Heidegger's meditations on the Greek temple at Boston, Cézanne, or his meditations on Cézanne's Mount St. Croix, or the Van Gogh A Pair of Shoes, where he explains the essence of art in terms of the concept of being and truth as indeed illuminating. Heidegger argues that art is not only a way of expressing the element of truth in a culture, but the means of creating it and providing a springboard from which that which is can be revealed. Works of art are not merely representations of the way things are, but actually produce a community's shared understanding. You can anchor self. Each time a new artwork is added to any culture, the meaning of what it is to exist is inherently changed. Heidegger believes that at its greatest, art grounds history by allowing truth to spring forth. In regards to the fundamental role of place here, this is his following meditation on the Greek temple. It is the temple work that first joins together and simultaneously gathers around itself the unity of those parts and relations in which birth and death, disaster and blessing, victory and disgrace, endurance and decline obtain the form of destiny or human being. The temple first gives to things their look, and to humanity their outlook on themselves. But there are other means in which art becomes vital in this struggle. AHI proposes one possibility from art in Istanbul, if I've understood the gist of your paper correctly. And Dale Hudson shows us the power that filmmaking can have in this context from Emirates. The very virtue of place for philosophical investigation of the concrete also means that it opens up the question of its mediation. Casey proposes a rereading of Bourdieu's Habitus as the in-between. Self and place, so habitus becomes an in-between self and place, nature and culture, the universal and particular. Therefore, the thinning out that we talked about earlier is actually a thinning out of the habitus that links places and selves. And it's an interesting argument that can be followed in Casey's work, but I'm not going to get into that. Yet, all is not lost. Casey provides an interesting analysis of various postmodern places that intensify the sense of place rather than the opposite. He gives the example of movies, and he says when the wide availability of movies and knockoff movies, and internet movies, all over the place, rather than undermining the sense of going to a theatre, it intensifies the experience of going to a theatre because it intensifies I don't want to use the word authentic, but a situation in which the self is really enmeshed in a particular context watching a movie. So paradoxically, the more there is of this fickle self, or this fickle encounter of thinned out places, the more deepening the other place becomes. He gives the other example of bookselling. He says Amazon had not necessarily undermined, it may have undermined a wide variety of bookshops, but he gives the example of Barnes and Nobles and other bookshops, and generally the human experience. By buying books online in a fickle space, as it were, people become more discerning of those places where the exact opposite is produced. And so the bookshop becomes a place in which there is this structured relationship pattern. Robert Young's example from Gaza might yet provide another example, and I await your response to that later. Case's conclusion is quite pertinent. The more the places are leveled down, the more, not the less, may cells be led to seek places in which their own personal enrichment can flourish. That's the formal end of my opening remarks. Now, I want to, you've all heard of Professor Sami Khalaf, and Professor Mellon Grant alluded to his work and his legacy. So to formally kick off the conference, Sami Khalaf will present with you two a paper titled The Spatial Information of Beirut, from Intimate Places to High Spaces. But before he does so, I'd like to introduce you to him, or introduce him to you. Sami Khalaf is a professor of sociology and director of the Center for Behavioral Research at the American University of Beirut, Lebanon. He's a graduate of AU, both BA and MA in the 50s, and Princeton in the mid-60s. He's held many academic appointments in Princeton, Harvard, MIT, and NYU, and he is the author of numerous journal articles, book chapters on comparative modernization, sociocultural history, urbanization, and post-war construction. A pioneer in the field of sociology in Lebanon. Among his books are Sexuality in the Arab World, with John Gannon in 2007, The Heart of Beirut, 2006, Civil and Uncivil Violence in Lebanon, 2012, Cultural Resistance, Global and Local Encounters in the Middle East, 2001, Beirut Reclaimed, 1994, Recovering Beirut with Philip Khoury, 1993, Lebanon's Predicament, 1987, Persistence and Change in 19th Century Lebanon, 1973, and Hamra of Beirut, 1973. I don't know how you did it, Professor Khalaf, but I'm still trying to get my first book out. He's been a recipient of several international fellowships and research awards, and appointed on the international jury to review master plans for the post-war reconstruction of Beirut. He is a trustee of several foundations and serves on the editorial boards of a score of international journals and publications. He's been recently honored at Harvard in 2007, and 3 programs at the University of Sydney and Melbourne in Australia, 2009. Now, he's been an inspiration for a whole generation of scholars indeed, including myself. I first heard of Professor Khalaf's name as a young undergraduate who escaped Lebanon to Australia, Sydney, Australia, in search of a better life. And at loss as to what to specialize in, I decided to enroll in Sociology 101, and wasn't sure what it was about, to be honest with you. But I figured if I did Sociology 101, I could probably unravel the mysteries of Lebanon and its complexities. And funny enough, as I started the course, in one of the earliest, first, second, third lecture maybe, my Professor Michael Humphrey, mentioned Sami Khalaf with such high esteem and encouraged me to do sociology and follow in the legacy, tradition, and footsteps of this eminent scholar from Lebanon. And so I did. And I ended up majoring as an undergrad in sociology and anthropology. Alas, I didn't do my master's and PhD in sociology. I got entirely lost along the way. But thank you very much for that inspiration. Although I was formally introduced to you today, I was informally introduced to you over 15 years ago by Dr. Humphrey, who sends his deepest regards. So without further ado, I cordially invite Professor Khalaf to present his paper. And then after Professor Khalaf's talk, I believe there is a short break, and then another talk. Thank you.
I must really thank Maher and his team for thinking about this conference. And I'm touched by the remarks of both Maher and Dr. Khoury. What I want to begin is really by a very personal episode, which inspired my early work on what I called at that time the geography of fear and landscape design. We left the war in Beirut in '84. Our two boys, the older boy was 8, the younger boy, Ramzi, was 1.5, early 2. We went to Princeton. Ramzi, the younger boy, started acting on Broadway at the age of 6 or 7. He appeared in many plays. And very early in his life, the aesthetics of plays played a very important part in his life. So we brought them in the summer of '92 to spend a few weeks reconnecting them with their heritage. Like me, you were probably jet lagged. You woke up very early. We were living in my brother's house on Clemenceau, and he got out and he heard the rooster. Second, he heard the muezzin. Third, the balcony was surrounded by jasmine and bougainvillea, and then the church bells. And then he thought that the rest of what he wants to see in Beirut is the same enchanting, aesthetic, pleasing encounter. And he said, Baba, yalla, why don't we walk? So we crossed Clemenceau and started going towards Hamra. He has the habit of running, and I have to call him back. But this time, Ramzi got close to me. He touched my hand, and I could tell he was sweating. Something in what he saw made him afraid, gave him the sense of dread, as it were. We didn't continue our walk, but it became then and there interested in what this young, intuitive boy experienced. One, the enchanting habitat, the enchanting environment. He never heard the rooster in Princeton. He never heard the muezzin. He never heard the church bells. So, yet, he was afraid. He was afraid. What he called me, the houses looked like Swiss cheese, I mean, with broken windows. So then and there, I started writing a little book on Beirut reclaim, using that theme. Edward Said was still alive at the time, and he says, Samir, look, I want to preface that book. And two architects, Hashim Sarkis and Hani Asfour, were just taking their PhD at Harvard, and he said, we want to design the book. And the book is very, very small, but unusually designed, because if I am talking about an area, the image is behind the text. And the book, was nominated for 2 awards. But never mind. It was that encounter that aroused my interest at that time, and realizing that many, many youngsters were not in touch with their geography. I mean, people during the war were isolated in little pockets. And I figured out it's the role of architects and urban planners and designers to make this connection, to start building a habitat that does not, at least preempt the fear which was widespread at the time. Look, in the short time I have, I would like to do 3 things, very, very briefly. First, and I think this is a problem that has not been addressed in Lebanon, I argue that the urban environment is a proxy victim of unappeased hate, unappeased hostility. The environment becomes fashil khil. You know, we can't curse the politicians, we can't curse the neighbors, but there is nobody who can speak on behalf of the environment. You see, the environment cannot say, you know. So the problem from the very beginning to me, who is going to speak on behalf, was speechless. And hence, I call upon urban planners, architects, designers to become a bit more aggressive in the plans. The second thing I want to do, which I did in one of my last books, is how do we merchandise space? And I would spend hours walking through the streets of Beirut, looking at panels. Beirut looks like an art exhibit at times. And the closer the panels to each other, I discovered there's something to hide. You cannot see. They were so close. It's only when you go somewhere else, begin to peek, you realize that they were hiding rich archaeological sites, Roman baths and other. So I want to look at, very briefly, some of the images, some of the slogans that urban developers have used to merchandise of this sort of scarce resource that we have in Lebanon. Finally, an issue to my surprise is not addressed. What is the connection between space and well-being? It's only lately that, I mean, going back to Ramzi, he was afraid in Beirut. But when we took him to Byblos, when we took him to Faqra, he did what he loves to do. He started dancing and singing. You know, so right then and there, I said, obviously, the environment has an impact, not only on who we are and our identity, but it has an impact on our productivity and our creative pursuit. So let me, I have the tendency of over-talking, so I have tendency to say, hey, stop, you have passed all your time. But let me begin with the first. The whole notion of how the habitat has become a proxy victim, you know. And this, by the way, is not new. In my own research, I find out that long before the devastation of the war, Beirut was default. You know, for example, one of these successive amendments to the building code, and it's the first building code we've had in history, in 1932, was passed by Parliament. It took them 20 years. In 1954, allowing a maximum 9 floors per building. But this, like perhaps other zoning regulations, were virtually ignored by builders. And Lebanese builders are ingenious about how to find, how to circumvent the laws. So since then, additional floors were built atop converted houses. Ground floors were normally used as a retail and shopping outlets. The courtyards are filled by new construction. But most damaging, the buildings are built just on the edge of the sidewalk. So Beirut became one of the rare cities without sidewalks, and until recently, and without the beauty of lush foliage. These, I'm arguing, and other instances are galling precisely because they have dire consequences on the country's ability to reclaim this threatened heritage. Although we are one of the smallest sovereign nations in the world, but we are burdened, one, by very high densities. I don't want to bore you with the figures. Two, by massive population shifts. And more important, and I use the word deliberately, by the frenzy of over-construction. Until recently, this threatened heritage had never become a public issue. I reviewed all the bayanat al-wizariya, the statements that new governments, provide to guide their work since independence. There's no mention. In other words, the environment, the habitat, in the eyes of our political culture, is not a public issue that ought to be addressed. With the absence of government authority, such excesses became more rampant. What had not been ravaged by the war, it was eaten up by greedy developers and impetuous consumers. Mercantilism and consumerism are the things that do that. Even sidewalks and private backyards are stripped and defied. As a result, Beirut today suffers from the lowest, and I got these facts recently, of open space per capita in the world. The entire metropolitan area of the city claims no more than 600,000 square meters of space. Only 600,000 square meters of open space. A United Nations report stimulates that each person requires an estimate of 40 square meters to qualify as a healthy environment. 40 square meters, a healthy environment. The coefficient in Beirut is 0.8. Imagine, where we are living. So my central argument today is that rampant commercialism, greed, enfeebled state authority could not, on their own, have produced such damage. These are being exasperated by what I call the pathos of a revelous, post-war mentality. Victims racked for so long by the atrocities of human suffering become insensitive to what they consider benign concerns. Hence, they become insensitive, and their rage with bitterness and long to make up for lost and past time. Hence, as I refer in my work, the two basic definitions of Lebanon are unappeased hostility, and I mean that. There is hostility that is never expressed. It is dormant, and mercantilism, more than others, begin to victimize the environment. And as I said, you know, the environment cannot say, cannot say, I'm in pain. Somebody must speak on behalf of this. So once again, the enchanting place is deformed, as the title of my article notes, a hyped space. In doing my readings, I came across a little book by John Rennie Short on global dimension. Look at the metaphors he uses to describe space and place. Very catchy. Space is them. Place is us. Space is there. Place is here. Space is general, but place is particular. Space is motion. Place is rest. Space is universal. Place is vernacular. Space is global. Place is local. Most interesting, he makes a distinction between space as Apollo, i.e., the god of order, the god of form, the god of rationality, the god of coherence, against Dionysius, the god of sexual power, ecstasy and passion. He goes on to say space is modern, place is postmodern, space is the global village, place is the village in the city, space is mind, place is body, space is becoming, place is being, and finally, space is spirit, place is soul. Very catchy. One could take these metaphors to argue how place is being taken over by space, and hence the Lebanese are constantly in this unsettling form of trying to rearrange the two together. Land use patterns, by the way, are in disarray. Mixed, heterogeneous communities have diminished. Decentralized areas have undermined Beirut's primacy and dominance. 2 days ago, and I invite some of you to go into the Marad. The Marad was built in 1920 to host the first international trade exhibit in the Arab world. There was not a soul in the Marad, not one person. Why? It's barricaded. The 4 entries to the Marad are barricaded because Nabi Berri wanted to preserve this area because he argues the center is being taken over by Sunnis, and we have to protect, this is what I'm told, we have to protect, central areas. The excuse that the parliament is there is just an excuse. So what I am saying, not only land use is an array, but equally graphic is the way the spaces and tempo of war have asserted their ferocious logic on the perceptions and the use of space. By the way, I don't have the time, the three modes which use, how space is conceived, how it is perceived, and how it is lived. On the three levels, there's a difference between the conception, the perceptions of planners, and the lived realities. For example, cities and sprawling suburbs are being ruralized, or converge into squatted settlements in the center and urban fringe. Conversely, rural areas are being urbanized. As such, at both ends, the habitat is the victim. And with internecine conflict and combat assumed water, the war has not only destroyed common places, it has reinforced the proclivities for the formation of exclusive and seclusive spaces. It has also generated a mood of lethargy and indifference. I talk a lot in my work about collective amnesia, and people want to forget, and it becomes simply a romantic vision. The issue here converges on who are the most qualified groups and agencies that can mobilize and speak on behalf of those who have been bereft of speech. My optimistic chapter at the end of my book on Level Drift, I say we have young groups now that are beginning to emerge to protest and mobilize reclaiming their damaged habitat. Now, how is space merchandised? This is very, very interesting. Let me begin by a few facts. There is obviously a frenzy of construction. Despite the global uncertainty, despite the political, unsettlement in the region, most recent estimates indicate that there are currently about 800 major real estate projects in the country. 800. Of which 400 about to be completed. But between 80 and 85% of these projects have already been sold. Before buildings are finished, there are buyers who take, so 85% of what you see, although they're empty, they have been sold. Hence, we are building not for the middle class to find homes, but we are building for greedy entrepreneurs to speculate. When I moved into Saifi village, the meter of land was 1,500. The meter, now it's 8,000. To buy a two-bedroom apartment, you have to invest $1,600,000 to enjoy an urban space that is should be at least behind. I don't want to again bore you with some further statistics, but to me, and I talk about this, Beirut is facing what Holland faced in the 17th century, a tulip mania. And in Holland, everybody left their fields and started building tulips. It didn't, planting tulips, it didn't last for too long. The tulip mania peaked around 1640 and had ruinous implications for the Dutch economy. Beirut is facing that prospect. Just walk around and realize all these buildings that have already been bought, yet there's very few that can be. Solidar alone has 78 massive projects under construction. 78, you know. So Beirut under construction seems like an open and ever-changing art show. The picturesque panels, of course, serve another hidden purpose. They hide, as I indicated, what they are building. I went around taking pictures of these panels. They're very beautiful pictures, and some of the panels are designed in using the latest techniques, very dense sort of photography. And let me tell you, okay. Let me tell you what I saw. Purchasing an apartment or a house becomes a signature project, a gateway to the timeless address. One has only to be promised the good life, the experience of serenity and natural charm. In Ashrafi building that has been going on for the past 8 years, will probably take another 8 years to finish, has the following adjectives, 12 of them. Comfort, luxe, famille, caractère, tradition, art, authenticité, résidence levantine, racine, harmonie, vie de quartier, and environment. I mean, what anything on earth is going to fulfill these promised plan? I could go on, but essentially, and this is where I invoke Durkheim, the values we are selling, the cliches we are merchandising cannot be realized. Yet we are hiding what we are destroying, and we are mystifying what we want to build. And it is this future that is really of concern to me. I want to just take 2 minutes to cut short my discussion, to make few remarks about building the habitat and the sense of well-being. Studies in photobiology, in color therapy, and other very novel areas of exploration all substantiate the same thing, the extent to which the environment has a direct effect on our physical, emotional well-being. Yet, this very same fact is totally overlooked in Lebanon and other places in the Arab world. Put simply, as Samir has indicated in his opening remark, places where we spend our time affect the people we are and who we are to become. And it's this reality that is sadly amiss. Let me part with 2 thoughts. Cities, civilizations, and citizenship, we often forget, share a linguistic and historical root, where cities, great or small, are not hospitable to the multiplicity of voices and the interplay of viewpoints, civil society will always suffer. And second, and more important, creating such a political culture of tolerance, or what I call in my work, difference without indifference, demands, among other things, that every Lebanese today should change his perception of the other. Only by doing so can we begin to transform the geography of fear into a genuine and guarded form of social existence. Thank you.
Please join us for coffee break, 15 minutes. And then Dean McGreevy will give his keynote speech as well. The opposite of here and now. As I said, I'm not going to lose Dean McGreevy. He comes from geography, and he started with one of the most important, I think, names in the theory of space, U321, if I'm not mistaken. Dean McGreevy was the first at UB as director of the Center for American Studies, which was founded by Arif Mukhtar. He was the first director, and he remained with us. And then he was the Ibn Said chair, I think, as well, for 1 year, which is a chair within this Center for American Studies. For the last 5 years now, we are living a kind of change, real change, especially in the Faculty for Arts and Sciences, and I would say thanks to Professor McGreevy. As I mentioned, he's starting now this collaboration with AUC as well. After Professor McGreevy's talk, we'll start directly with the first session. Moderator is Herman Gens from archaeology, our colleague. Everyone has 20 minutes while we're having the panel. So please don't worry. Yesterday I made a mistake mentioning only 10 minutes for one of our colleagues, and then we changed it. So please make sure that everyone has 20 minutes, and then we open a discussion. Please welcome with me Dean McGreevy.
Thank you, Maher. I've enjoyed all the comments so far and the talks. They've been very interesting. So my talk is called The Opposite of Here and Now. A number of years ago, after a personal tragedy, I began to see certain things differently. Let me give you 2 examples. First one came upon me gradually. I began to notice that when I looked at the face of, say, a middle-aged person, I couldn't help but imagine that same face as a child in youth and in old age. At any particular moment, a face seemed unstable to me, part of the process of growth and decay. It was as if my eyes wanted to speed up the process, like an effect in a horror film in which a face ages and melts from its skull in seconds. Or a time-lapse sequence showing a plant growing, blooming, and withering. The second experience grew out of my habit of taking long walks beyond the edges of the town where I lived in western Pennsylvania and out into the forested landscape of the Allegheny Plateau, which consisted of rounded hilltops and deeply incised, steep-sided valleys. It's a topography shaped primarily by the slow action of water and gravity, unaffected by mountain building, glaciers, earthquakes, or any sort of catastrophic events. Yet it didn't seem stable to me. In my walks, I often encountered abandoned railroad beds, shacks, mining equipment, and other evidence of human habitation, now overcome with vegetation and erosion, resulting from steady precipitation and endless fluvial processes. Everything seemed to be sliding downhill. And again, like a sped-up film sequence, I could almost see the entire landscape flowing into the sea. Ultimately, I thought, it's as if we're all living on the San Andreas Fault. The earth isn't stable beneath us. And what about those human settlements sitting on top of these little round hills with their geometric structures and their street patterns? It began to seem like a mere birdcage of provisional architecture in relation to the void that surrounded it. So it was an odd sensation for me, and it's as if I had a kind of X-ray vision that revealed the ceaseless flux all around me. How could I have missed it before? I had become a Heraclitus. You can't go down to the same river twice because both you and the river are flowing and changing. Or perhaps a Becketarian, because Samuel Beckett was impressed by the fact that, as his character Lucky put it, existence dwindles toward the great cold, the great dark, a void about which no statement from any human voice can tell us anything at all. Interestingly, the condition of humans, both individually and collectively, for Beckett, is the same. As one of his commenters summarizes, around us on every side in space lies the void. Behind us, before us in time, lies the void. To see what circumscribes the human drama as a yawning chasm may seem a particularly modern sort of consciousness. Someone like Blaise Pascal suddenly awoke to the disturbing immensity of the universe. For us, I suppose, on one level, it just seems indisputable. There's a tradition in my discipline, geography, and I think it exists in many other disciplines, of sort of paying attention to this void. We were very fond of startling undergraduates with statements like this one: if the age of the earth were a 24-hour day, all of human history would occupy 3/10 of a second. We present them with images of our fragile planet from space, and with maps showing that humans, contrary to what you probably think, you undergraduates, are confined to only the dry 25% of the Earth's surface, and almost completely to the 10% of that that's arable, in other words, 2.5%, which means 97.5% of the Earth's surface is almost completely empty of human beings. But these sort of facts are easy enough to ignore as we go about our daily business. Is it a kind of madness to dwell on the temporal and spatial limitedness of human existence? Geographers are interested in how humans create worlds. To what extent do they do it against the background of, or in reaction to the immensity of what these worlds exclude? A living thing, writes Nietzsche, can only be healthy, strong, and productive within a certain horizon. If it be incapable of drawing one around itself, it will come to an untimely end. Thomas Pynchon's Mason and Dixon is a novel that turns on the central metaphor of the boundary. A British astronomer and a cartographer survey a perfectly westward trending line toward the heart of 18th century North America, a line that will later mark the division that culminates in the US Civil War. It goes back, Mason tells us, to the second day of creation, when God divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament. Thus, the first boundary line. All else after that in all history is but subdivision. So creation requires distinction, but also exclusion, perhaps repression. We have dreamt the world, Borges writes. We have dreamt it as firm, mysterious, visible, ubiquitous in space, and durable in time. But in its architecture, we have allowed tenuous and eternal crevices of unreason which tell us it is false. So are the places and worlds we create arbitrary, provisional bastions against the void? When the ancient Greeks banished anthropophagi, what we later called cannibals, as well as Amazons and centaurs, to the edge of the Ecumene, to the edge of the map, the world map, they were defining their own world, their own cultural world, by what it was not. Beyond the human world was chaos and disorder. The human possibilities were all at the center. So how do we get from that sort of consciousness to the notion that the periphery is a zone of possibility? Again, Thomas Pynchon's character, Mason, muses. Does Britannia, when she sleeps, dream? Is America her dream? In which all that cannot pass in the metropolitan wakefulness is allowed expression away in the restless slumber of these provinces, and on westward, wherever 'tis not yet mapped nor written down, ever behind the sunset, safe till the next territory to the west be seen and recorded, measured and tied in, back into the network of points already known that slowly triangulates its way into the continent, changing all from subjunctive to declarative, reducing possibilities to simplicities that serve the ends of governments, winning away from the realm of the sacred its borderlands, one by one, and assuming them into the bare mortal world, which is our home and our despair. So, for Mason, the ordinary world of the here and now had been completely disenchanted and seemed devoid of possibilities. There's a tradition in geography called geosophy. Geosophy is the study of how people understand the world, geographical ideas, theories, perceptions, imaginaries. Geography's empirical tradition, on the other hand, embodied in the authority of the map, has often assumed a godlike vantage point, as if humans could somehow evacuate themselves from the world and view it from the outside. Clearly, finding possibilities in the periphery represented a geographical or a geosophical shift in how people understood and also how they experienced the here and now of daily life. Some of my own work has focused on this shift, and drawing on some of it today, I want to sketch how both the structuring of space and the understanding of it have shifted, comparing certain aspects of the European medieval world with the new one that emerged full-blown in parts of Europe and North America by the 19th century. My underlying question is this: where, when, is the place, time of possibility? The medieval cosmos was bounded. The earth was enclosed within a set of spheres. It was one colossal room. The cathedral is a serviceable model of that cosmos. Humans were at the center. It's a world that is immense, mysterious, but bounded, built around humans and their drama. It was a vertical dimension primarily that allowed room to imagine something beyond the ordinary: heaven, purgatory, hell. Though both Jews and Christians conceived of history as centered around a singular event, the lives of medieval Europeans, like most agriculturalists, were structured by the recurring cycle of the seasons. It was a hierarchical world that rested on the exploitation of peasants. Yet from time to time, this world was ruptured by festivals such as Christmas. It was a public event in which feasting, drinking, dancing, and even lechery were permitted. Social hierarchies were relaxed, and sometimes even inverted by the appointment of boy bishops or lords of misrule. Fuel and food and other goods were distributed to the poor. A ritual revolt. For a time, we might say, peasants experienced a world of possibility, of freedom, equality, and plenty. There's a long-standing debate about the meaning of such temporary ruptures of structure. Some have argued that festivals have a cathartic effect, providing outlets for hostility, and thus they strengthen the present order. Marx seemed to suggest that ritual rebellion could be a significant step in the development of revolutionary class consciousness. There are also a number of historical examples of rebellions in New World slave communities during Christmas and other festivals. Mikhail Bakhtin argued that common people, quote, opposed the official and serious tone of medieval ecclesiastical and feudal culture. The festival for him was no mere respite from ordinary existence. It was a subversive rejection of its structure, an expression of the common people's criticism, their deep distrust of official truth, and their highest hopes and aspirations. Of course, Bakhtin tells us nothing about the efficacy of such ritual rebellions. They were temporally confined, embedded within a cycle of seasons which continued. Another escape from medieval life was pilgrimage. The pilgrim, of course, journeyed to a distant place, a center out there, as anthropologist Victor Turner's phrase, a place where this world was believed to be connected to another. For the devout pilgrim, at least, pilgrimage was an experience of freedom, equality, and hope. Unlike festivals, the quotidian, day-to-day world was not transformed into a world of possibilities. It was simply left behind. In this sense, it would seem less threatening to the status quo. Moreover, fairs, circuses, and exotic markets always crowded around the pilgrimage churches of Europe. These activities, like pilgrimage itself, were outside the realm of ordinary life. They all belonged together, as Victor Turner notes, in a place set apart. The pilgrimage was a cosmopolitan experience that might engender a little bit of contrapuntal consciousness, especially for those pilgrims who ventured beyond the enclosed world of medieval Christendom toward Jerusalem. The Renaissance amounted to what Yifu Tuan calls an axial transformation from a vertical to a horizontal world. The European geographical discoveries and conquests were inspired in part by the imagination of new possibilities on the horizons. In the Palazzo Vecchio in Florence, in the 16th century, maps of all the continents and new discoveries were arranged around the wall so that the European could gaze out horizontally and dominate the globe. It was the theater of the round world. That was the title of Ortelius's first book that attempted to compile all the world's maps. What later became known as an atlas, after Mercator's later similar book. And of course, we have to remember the most famous theater in England at the time was the Globe. In an accelerating way, from the 16th century onward, the structuring of everyday life was undergoing similarly dramatic changes. Gravestones for individuals were appearing. Of course, we live in such an individualized world today that it's hard to imagine that there was a different world. Graves began to appear with individual people's names on it, not just kings, ordinary people. Individual chairs at dining tables, a new invention. Separate plates and utensils. Individual seats in theaters like these here, one for each. By the 19th century, cities were also being segmented in all sorts of ways, and most noticeably along class lines. Friedrich Engels' description of the rings of social classes in 19th century Manchester became the starting point for David Harvey's journey from scientific to critical geography. At the same time, the entire globe was being restructured, in Harvey's view, as incessant crises of capitalism led empires to seek new markets and sources of raw materials, a spatial fix to crises. Some of my work has focused on the emergence of new spatial structures in antebellum North America, a time when millions experienced the so-called market revolution that transformed them from subsistence farmers to full participants in the cash economy of industrial and commercial capitalism. In cities especially, the new economy meant that individuals must sell their labor for cash in order to survive. Unlike in subsistence farming and traditional craft industries, which were organized around households, the place of work was now separated from the place of family life. This removed women from their former roles as important contributors to the family economy. And since rural to urban migration had often reduced households to mere nuclear families, women found themselves confined to child-rearing roles. The new bifurcated geography of everyday life was accompanied by new understandings. To many, I dare say most, the public world seemed like a very heartless place. A place of competition that rewarded ambition, self-reliance, and selfishness. The family home, in contrast, seemed a refuge of cooperation, selflessness, presided over by the untainted female. It was a haven where the innocence of children could be protected. The private family home became a place where a life approaching the ideal could be imagined. And in order to celebrate this private utopia, a new festival suddenly appeared in Britain and North America in the 1840s. Christmas. Christmas, although always presented as ancient, was not. Christmas had almost completely died out by the year 1800. In fact, antiquarians were so worried that all traces of Christmas were being lost that they were eagerly collecting ritual songs and customs, lest they be forgotten. So the Victorian Christmas, which again is always presented to us as old, was a brand new invention. Santa Claus, unlike all of his various predecessors or precursors, was a completely jolly character. The giving of gifts, especially within the household, was never part of a pre-19th century Christmas. Moreover, these early festivals had always been public community celebrations. The new Christmas, with the Christmas tree at the center, was focused on the interior of the bourgeois home. As with medieval festivals, there's a debate about the extent to which Christmas supported the structure of industrial and commercial capitalism. Because Christmas seems to offer a re-enchanted realm separate from the cruel competition of the public world, it might be seen as a kind of commentary on the encompassing structure, or at least an indication of what people idealized. But can it comment on the very thing that provides its own viability, the separation of the world into two realms? The selfless labors of the home, which are so celebrated at Christmas, restore individuals, enabling them to plunge back into the world where, as Marx put it, every man finds in his fellow men not the realization, but the limitation of his own freedom. The enchantment completely dissipates on the morning after Christmas, when all are confronted by the quotidian reality of the situation. Even for those who embrace it fully, Christmas remains only a temporary respite from those realities. Moreover, gift buying and other consumption feeds the very system that the holiday's altruism is purported to question. Historian Charles Sellers suggests that the market revolution in North America entered its decisive phase in 1825 with the completion of the Erie Canal, which connected the interior of the continent to the cash-based world focused on the financial and commercial emporium of New York City. And it was New York people who built the canal and made this connection. And in one sense, this was a remarkable demonstration of agency, of the human ability to structure the human geography of an entire continent. The British, however, might have made that connection to the interior first, via the St. Lawrence River. Canada might have become the superpower. The South may have done it, perhaps leading to a victory in the Civil War. Or like South America or Africa, North America might have wound up divided up into many, many small countries. So in a sense, agency affected how that all turned out. But agency was most likely powerless to halt the juggernaut of the market. Many of the laborers who actually built the canal were forced from the land by enclosure movements in places like Ireland. Although they were referred to as free laborers, they were not free to do anything except go to wherever someone was willing to pay them money for their labor so that they could buy the necessities of life with cash. Slaves were too valuable for canal work. Why buy a slave when you can rent one much cheaper? And it gets worn out or dies, it doesn't matter. The first labor riots in U.S. history occurred among these common laborers on the Erie Canal. The state militia quickly crushed them. Their revolts apparently achieved absolutely nothing. Laborers had no bourgeois homes to serve as refugees from the heartless world. It was heartless through and through for them. The middle class reaction to the new market world erupted through a number of channels. Like the cult of domesticity and the Christmas festival, each of these outlets assumed the form of an antidote to the selfishness and coldness of the new order. Religious revivals burned through the northern U.S. Reform movements to improve education, prisons, orphanages followed these. The women's rights movement pushed for equality and suffrage. The abolition movement very loudly spoke for an end to slavery. A powerful temperance movement attempted to eliminate the evils of alcohol. Charles Sellers argues that it was, quote, only by headlong flight into benevolence that many could tolerate the market's calculating egoism. He concluded their pessimistic piety belies our historical mythology of capitalism as, or excuse me, of capitalistic transformation as human development. George Lukács wrote that the bourgeois way of life consists of a renunciation of all brilliance in life so that all the brilliance, all the splendor may be transferred elsewhere. In the US, there were a number of other elsewheres, many of them associated with the nation. And they included images of the West and of the future. The opposite of elsewhere is here and now. Instead of imagining some distant, better place, might we be able to transform the world at hand? Revolutions, of course, are attempts from particular locations and moments to fundamentally transform the structure of the world. Uprisings sometimes also trigger each other across space. 1848, 1917, 1968, 2011. In some cases, things change fundamentally. But in other cases, it may be that revolutions and uprisings are like festivals that release pent-up frustrations, increasing the resiliency of the status quo by providing it with the opportunity to incorporate dissident ideas, energies, and people. I began today by exploring the awareness of human life as strikingly limited and ephemeral, encompassed by a void. This sort of consciousness, unlike the sequestered elsewheres of the bourgeois home, the golden future, the promise of heaven, may allow us at least to see one thing more clearly, the material reality of our situation, and the space-time wherein our limited freedom lies. If there is a chance of changing fundamental structures, of moving beyond both the selfishness and the banality of the world from which so many recoiled when they first experienced it in the 19th century, the place of possibility cannot be some distant or secluded elsewhere or elsewhen. I'm not suggesting a return to something earlier. That would be another elsewhere. Nor am I suggesting that fundamental change can be accomplished in a day. What I am saying is that new possibilities must be discovered among actual human beings who always live here and now. The only zone of co-evil existence. Thank you.
So, good afternoon. I'd like to welcome you all to our first panel entitled Geographical Spaces, Vision and Control. And we have two presentations right now. According to the program, we will have both presentations directly following each other, and then we have hopefully time for discussion. So the first speaker will be Kurt Franz. He actually informed me about a slight change. He's not based at the German Orient Institute anymore, but since 3 weeks, I believe, is based at the University of Tübingen. His paper is called Changing Concepts of Space, Al-Muqaddasi and Yakut.
So, dear colleagues, do you just understand me? I had the impression it's better not like that. Okay, the impression was too close, perhaps. I'm very grateful to the organizers and Arts and Humanities Initiative for the invitation to this conference, which is truly interdisciplinary. And I'm much looking forward to discussion between contemporary studies and, in my case, historical studies, and thanks a lot again for the opportunity to come here. All talks that you have heard so far share a certain conviction that it were naive to address space and place as if it were a realm of simply existing features. I'm entirely positive that all of us do approach place and space in a critical mind as something that is socially relevant and contested by conflicting human interests. Moreover, as something that is subject to intellectual conception. Conceptions that find their expression in certain makeups, be they mental. Okay, I'm sorry. Shall I repeat it?
You can use this one.
Well,
That's a really good one.
whatever.
It's just like this.
Okay. I think we are entirely positive that we share a very critical approach to place and space as something that is socially relevant and contested by human interests. Something that is subject to intellectual conceptions, which find their expression in certain makeups, be they mental, graphic, literary, or cinematic. In a word, ideas of space are human and social instead of natural. For this reason, they are manifold, they are fraught with tensions, and at times politically contradict each other. Today's and tomorrow's papers will be replete with examples of these circumstances, and I'm looking forward to learning more, for instance, on Emirati filmmaking or Palestinian literature in these respects. I make a point of the social and intellectual nature of space and place because I find that it characterizes historical times just as well as it does with regard to modernity. On the other hand, it appears to me that the dealings of medieval Arabic authors with space and place have been rarely conceived in a critical way. Sad enough, the spatial turn in humanities and social sciences has touched the historical study of Islam but very little. Still today, questions prevail that were urgent in the 19th century when topography was in the foreground because the Middle East, as Europeans saw it, was largely a blank map that required to be filled in. Which place name belongs to which geographic locality? That was the typical kind of question asked for a long time for good reasons, but not so good reasons. But we should not only ask these questions today. I'm saying something which sounds very much familiar, too familiar to you, but in fact, in the context of historical study of Islam, this is something which still has to be stated to go on. I wouldn't be here today if I didn't take a different view. With regard to medieval Arabic geography, I shall argue the concepts of space as enshrined in literature were diverse, and what is more, that they were changing in correspondence to developments in politics, society, and science. I therefore aim at historicizing geographical scholarship through diachronic comparison. To do so, I will examine two works, namely the Ahsan al-Taqasim of al-Muqaddasi and the Mu'jam al-Buldan of Yaqut. They are comparable because both represent the Arabic géographie humaine, as Anthony Calix put it, while they basically disregard the astronomical and mathematical variety of geography. Moreover, both authors are scientific hallmarks of their respective age, and differences between them will be indicative of a larger tableau. So, how do the two of them conceive geospace in the prolegomena and when presenting their material? And do the concepts correlate with the political organization and scientific development of each one's time? And what is the difference of meaning between the difference of meaning of space and place as they use it between the two? Before discussing their particular historical concepts of space, it should be imperative to reflect upon what are one's own concepts, so my concept. Especially as the organizers of this conference have chosen to put me quite at the beginning of the conference, I would like to add to Muhajirat and Simon Mahmoud's introduction with a few general remarks. First of all, what is space? For a very elementary notion, I suggest that space is that which shows the following properties: extensiveness, locality, and topology. Extensiveness means that we have got to do with areas and bodies. Locality means that areas have a discrete position, however frayed or overlapped. And topology means that there are positional relationships between them. The same is of course true for places, since places can only be conceived when embedded in space, or as we've heard before, in the void which surrounds them. The same does not hold for places, for instance, on the other hand, there are places that, there are spaces that do not hold places, for instance, certain maritime spaces or terra incognita. Secondly, how can space be approached analytically in humanities and social sciences? Of course, there's a lot of literature on that. I just suggest something which is that is handy for this purpose and which is also suitable to include Arabic literature. So with the three said properties in mind, I suggest a triangular model between spatial cognition, spatial features, and spatial practice. And I have just by coincidence chosen that spatial cognition is on top. It could be the other way around as well. Spatial cognition, or spatial, and let's start with the features. Spatial features are understood here as all perceivable real-world phenomena that have a spatial nature to them, understood in the sense of extensiveness, locality, and topology. Well, basically something which is real, or which is considered real by man. Spatial cognition is how man perceives spatial features and practices, how these are understood, how they are conceived and fancied, and eventually how this is expressed in literature, in cartography, and various sorts of imagery. In this, there are always two interlocking elements, content and intent. Content is the conveyance of information and which constitutes the descriptive side of geographic knowledge. At the same time, intent provides for a conceptual side. Virtually every statement is informed by concepts, by wishful thinking, but also by prohibitions on thinking. To sum up, I argue that spatial cognition, both descriptive and conceptual, needs to be analyzed as part of normative agendas that there were. Last, spatial practice is human agency in as much as it responds to spatial features and also encroaches upon them. Spatial agency is informed by the cognition of spaces and places, while at the same time pertinent agendas are rooted in economy, society, and politics. Of these three, I will today dwell particularly on spatial cognition, you will not be surprised by that, with sketchy references only to how they are driven by period-specific agendas. The first word to be touched upon here is the Ahsan al-Taqasi, or the best division of knowledge, authored by al-Maqdisi or al-Muqaddasi, as most Western scholars usually refer to him. He is considered to have summarized the so-called classical geography in Arabic language, and thus he is the latest author to have been included in the famous and commendable collection of editions entitled Bibliotheca Geographorum Arabicorum. The first version of the book was authored mostly in Shiraz, southern Iran, and accentuated the role of the Samanid dynasty. The second version was accomplished around the year 1990 and focuses more on the Fatimids of Egypt and Syria. The work's standard edition, provided by Michael Jan de Moulian in 1877, is some 500 pages thick. It is built of three sections: an introduction of some 8 pages, and 2 circles of chapters. The first circle of chapter deals with the regions of the Arab, that is the Islamic Near East and North Africa, while the second circle of chapters treats the region of the Ajam, so Islamic Iran. In result, the notion of spaces and Muqaddasi promotes it is restricted to the Islamic part of the world, while the lands beyond are neglected. Remarkably enough, his subject is not labeled with the legal term Dar al-Islam, but with the peculiar expression Mamlakat al-Islam. This sounds very much like a political term. In fact, the period when the book was written did not know any encompassing political organization of Islamic lands. Even worse, the schism between Sunni and Ismaili, between Sunni and Shi'i, and in between the Shi'i observances between Ismaili and Imami observances, tore apart the region without even corresponding to the said East-West division. Clearly, the idea of a single and continuous Mamlakat al-Islam is an anachronism. It evokes past glory, namely that of the Abbasid Empire of mid-9th century, when East and West were still unified under the Caliphate. Beneath the dichotomic division of Arab and Ajam, the book is subdivided into 14 aqalim, climates. Notably, these aqalim are not the climes of Greek astronomical tradition, such as was still reiterated by Al-Idrisi in the 2nd and next century. Instead, Al-Muqaddasi's climes are these, and I just list them: Arabia, Al-Iraq, Aqur, which is the Jazeera, Syria, Egypt, and Al-Maghrib, to name just the western ones. In the east, there are Al-Mashriq, Al-Daylam, Al-Rihab, Al-Jibal, Khuzestan, Fars, Kirman, and As-Sind. These climes coincide with traditional units of cultural geography, which may simply be called countries. In that way, Al-Muqaddasi presents a world that has a structural order, and more in particular, an order that is almost symmetrically built. There were two halves, of which the Arab one comprises 6 subdivisions and the Iranian 1/8. What is more, the hemispheres correspond to each other in that both of them are located around a central area with neither cultivation nor permanent settlement. In the west, it is the Syrian Badia, and in the east, in Iran, it is the Mafaza, the Dashti Kabir. So we have 2 deserts or desert-like areas in the midst of these 6 or respectively 8 separate areas of countries. Then, when Al-Muqaddasi goes into detail, he expressly focuses on 4 subject matters: the description of towns, the description of roads, the drawing of a map of each clime, and lastly, the description and delimitation of districts, Kuwa. As a result, the world Al-Muqaddasi deems it worth to be described is neatly arranged in a hierarchical 3-tier order: halves, climes, and districts. Together, they form the Mamlakat al-Islam, a term that I now suggest would best be rendered as Islamic ecumen. As a result, Al-Muqaddasi's geography preserves ideas of togetherness on religious grounds and of territorial continuity as arose from the original expansion of Islam, but which was outdated in his lifetime. His description of the present world is thus modeled in a normative manner on an ideal past. Space, in this sense, is a means through which the balanced order of a God-given creation materializes. Of course, the author does not at all deny that the world is subject to change, but secular development is part of the Islamic course of history from the creation to the Day of Judgment. The agenda, of course, from the day from the revelation of the Quran to the Day of Judgment. The agenda behind it, in my interpretation, is a strongly conceptual geography that transcends the political division of his time. It instead stresses the splendor of the Islamic ecumen that had been, and implicitly, is desired, if not even expected, to arise again. The other work in discussion today is the Mu'jam al-Buldan, written by Yaqut al-Rumi and al-Hamawi. He conceived the idea to this work in Morocco and Central Asia in 1218 and achieved the initial version in Mosul 6 years later in 1224. The fair copy he began to write down in Aleppo in 1228. Working on it to the day of his death next year, he could finalize but a small part of the revision. The standard print edition was offered by Ferdinand Wüstenfeld in 1860-73. It comprises 4 volumes of a total of 3,800 pages, plus 2 supplementary volumes of notes and indexes. With this tremendous size, is the largest geography produced so far in Arabic language, to be topped only by, I think, one other by Oman. Sharing the contemporary trend to produce encyclopedic work, the Mu'jam al-Buldan is a geographic lexicon. The author pursues a method of literary review in combination with philological criticism and personal observation. It pushes the work's philological character so far as to stress that his main subject, really the main subject, are the names of places. He's very clear about it's not the places, his main subject are the names of places. This said, it is indeed appropriate to render the title Mu'jam al-Buldan as Dictionary of Towns. It is not the first such work, I owe you an explanation what is meant with the philological discussion. He starts each and every article with a discussion of the pronunciation, of the real pronunciation of the name, any possible local variants in pronunciation, lexicographical discussion, what does this word substantially mean, and references to literature and poetry. And sometimes this philological introduction swallows up the article. It is not the first such lexicographical work in Arabic tongue, but definitely by far the most comprehensive, most accessible, and the most successful one. These features earned it unshakable fame among source authors and modern researchers as well. The lexicon starts with a prolegomena section that counts some 40 pages in print, that is 5 times the size of Al-Muqaddasi's introduction. The first third of it is dedicated to methodology, while the latter 2/3 deal with particular aspects of geography. Then come the articles. The articles are arranged in alphabetic order from Alif to Ya. The vast majority of them pertain to settled places. Meanwhile, a few articles are of a summary, thematic nature in that they relate to generic geographic features. For example, the article Harra covers lava deserts, particularly on the Arabian Peninsula. Besides geographic information, in the narrow sense, most articles include 3 more sources of information. First, most prominent is local prosopography. Almost every article provides the names of the most important scholars that derive from the place of the questions, and of course, the fuqaha rank first among them. Second additional source of information, a great deal of historical data is provided, especially with regard to the Arab conquests and the Abbasid Caliphate, but also to the subsequent regimes down to the Ayyubid period. Third additional source of information, much poetry is introduced so as to underpin the cultural relevance of the place. I would like to characterize this poetry as it is used by Dawood as georeference poetry. With this blend of elements and genres, the Mu'jam al-Buldan is distinguished as a geographical, historical encyclopedia that inscribes itself both into the fields of scientific and Arab literature. As concerns the scope of the work, it is not problematically limited to the lands of Islam, although the articles in fact do not go beyond it. Different from Al-Muqaddasi, neither order nor balanced arrangement are an issue. Instead, alphabetical arrangement has it that space is something that is composed of natural and cultural landscapes which are scattered over the Earth's surface. Although each of them is dedicated to a special article, they much more often are referred to in articles on the towns they hold. In this manner, individual locales and their specific local conditions appear by far more prominent and tangible than regions do. In a nutshell, and as a tendency, place prevails over space. I cut a little bit shorter than I intended to. Let me just express that this sort of understanding of space is something which we can turn a normalized understanding of space and not so much loaded with concepts and not so much loaded with anachronistic reflections on past glory. In summary, we encounter two largely different concepts of space. Muqaddasi presents an orderly, hierarchically structured Islamic ecumene, whereas Yakut conceives an extensive, non-hierarchical, and essentially ceaseless Jew space. The differences arise both from their prolegomena and their overall arrangement. I'm aware that this assessment is highly interpretative. In any case, it illustrates that if we venture to historicize geography, on one hand, we also gain, on the other hand, a fresh perspective on history in that we can put history in the changing context of spatial recognition. Thanks a lot for listening.
Thank you. If you have questions, we should hold these for after the next talk. So I would like now to introduce Christa Banks. He's a visiting professor in the field of landscape design at AUB. And the title of his talk is The Visualized World of Perspectives and Control.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm happy to be here and thankful for the invitation to give this lecture. What I'm going to speak about is the visualized world of perspectives and control, and I have written a paper that is about 15 pages long, so I can't start reading it, and therefore I decided to make a PowerPoint show, realizing that I have far too many PowerPoint slides. So that seems always to be the case. My main argument is that the way we see is related to how we visualize and how we apply perspectives, manage orientation and control in different ways. When I say different ways, I mean that various historical periods have different ways of doing these things. And what I'm claiming that these various matters, seeing perspectives and so on, are very much interrelated. So as everybody else, even I seem to have the need to define these central concepts. Space as a quantified, intersubjective image that can be communicated, place as something meaningful, territory as reflecting the world of control and interests. And this is of course an analytical way of defining these concepts, but my argument is that in history these are always intertwined. Let me start with how we see things. I have drawn heavily here on Lise Bech, who is a Danish art historian, and she claims that how we see in history has actually changed. We always think that seeing is the most objective of senses, but she claims differently. Just to give a small foretaste, we can see in terms of the vertical plane or the horizontal plane. So we can relate what we see to the horizontal plane or see it in screens vertically. We can start by looking at the center and widening our focus so we can read a picture or a view from right to left or from left to right. And of course, all these various ways have different theories also that they are based on. So Beck claims that the original way of seeing is in terms of solids that are actually part of a vertical visual plane as textures, contours, silhouettes. And then she claims that this was typical for the classical age in Greece, but during the Hellenistic age it already changed into screen seeing. And so now the main point or the main field of reference was actually the vertical visual field. And she says that this way of seeing was prevailing in Europe until the end of Middle Ages in the Islamic culture. And typical for this seeing would be that the way of patterning the view is actually a way of seeing it as a representation of some higher being. So basically a religious way of seeing. Then a third case emerged during the early Renaissance, that is to see three-dimensional, and that means also to see voids which were not seen before. It sounds strange that people would not have seen voids before the Renaissance, but seeing space, as we would say it maybe now, but that's what she claims. So this came about with, of course, with the Brunelleschi invention of the line-up perspective in the early 15th century. Then our fourth way of seeing is related to Gestalt psychology created in Germany, and it's very much related to modernism in arts and architecture. The last way of seeing that is actual now is the transparent way of seeing, where we see screens that are overlaid to each other. It's interesting because this theory was formulated some more than 20 years ago, and only now we seem to be actual screen way of seeing. Well, how do we know how people have been seeing before? It's of course, we can only study it through arts and architecture, and I will now make a small expose in these matters, mainly through different kind of perspectives. So the first oldest perspective is a perspective that is called the value perspective, where each figure gets its size according to its importance. So Tutankhamun and his queen in this picture are really, their attendants are very small. And it reflects actually a worldview that I shall elaborate more on, that not to see but to be seen in this kind of perspective. If you look at the pyramids, they represent, of course, the same way that the most important things are the big ones and the other ones are very small. If you look at a view of London from the 18th century, made by Canaletto, who made a lot of these kind of London views, you can see that the religious buildings are the dominants in the townscape. And so it's basically a medieval worldview, of course, because still when this picture was made, it was the industrial society. Associated with this kind of value perspective is an introvert worldview, as documented in a whole set of so-called Mappa Mundi in the medieval fashion, where Holy Jerusalem is in the middle, then the world the moon and sun outside is the firmament of its star, and the heavens outside, all of that. Everything looking inwards. This is also found actually in medieval art, especially in the Byzantine art, where they applied actually a design perspective or a constructive perspective, but it was a so-called reverse perspective. It means that the vantage point is not behind a picture, so and it creates then it's behind the back of the viewer, so it creates the psychological feeling that it's the picture who looks at you, not you at the picture. And so in Byzantine art, it's very typical. And there is a lot of these kind of pictures to be in the art in this way. I just want to end this value perspective by referring actually to one of the key lectures today, the building of central Beirut at the moment. This picture is actually from Hong Kong. Here we have actually returned to the value picture in the sense that we claim that the way we build our cities is a necessity, an economic necessity. We have to build high because the land is so valuable. Of course, it's the other way around. Because we build high, the land is valuable, but this does not enter the notice of media. Anyway, in this kind of environment, we also, I think, psychologically easily feel that the world, those big buildings are looking at us and we are not actually looking at them. Often it's also actually impossible to look at them from this frog perspective, which we have to apply when we are down at the street. The next perspective was then associated with the creation of the linear perspective, the 1 point, 2 point, 3 point perspectives. Here is Brunelleschi up to the in the right upper corner, who was the inventor of this kind of perspective, and then emerged a lot of Renaissance art actually using this perspective. Here we have a central perspective on an idealized townscape from the 1460s also. Its most spectacular result, this perspective way of seeing actually reaching Ruhe, that is a residential city with the castle of the prince in the middle, the park on one side and the town on the other side. And the prince in the middle, he can be seen from everywhere and he can see actually everywhere. And this is the essence of this linear perspective, I think, to see and to receive. Then it became a fashion among nobles and royals in Europe. This is a map of landscape parks outside Paris at the 18th century, and as you can notice, only Versailles itself is bigger than the whole of historical Paris, not to speak about all these other landscape parks. That means that the landscape park was used as an appropriation of the suburban landscape to an extent that was actually larger than what industrial managed later. And especially then during the Baroque time, there was an obsession of fixing infinity. So when you establish this all-on perspective, you want to raise up the vanishing point, the point which we're looking at on a hilltop or on a hillside. So the longest ones are actually over 20 kilometers from the water is in Europe as well. Then the linear perspective was of course used in architecture horizon to reach certain images and or effects, visual effects. This is an abbey, the inner ceiling of an abbey, which where you get the perception of infinity, although it's a flat roof. There were a lot of jokes, of course, how to use the perspective for fooling people, and in modern arts it's still used a lot. Then the third perspective way is the labyrinthic way. It's not to see and not to be seen. They are basically two forms of labyrinth. One is the maze and the other one is the labyrinth proper. The maze means that you have a multi-cursal way of orienting. In the labyrinth proper, you have only one way of walking. The tribal city, which was referred to earlier, is in my view a typical labyrinthian version, and it's actually related to the organization of tribal society, which I have not time now to elaborate, but the main thing is that to reach any point in this city from the main street, the Souk Street, there is only one short way actually. There is always the shortest way. And if you don't find your way from the start and make the right decisions, you will never find the thing you are looking for. In park history, the most famous labyrinth is Lenotta's labyrinth in Marseille, which is based on the maze idea that you have to make decisions, and at each point of decision you had to solve a moral riddle, and this morality expressed was at that time a new moral. It was the moral of the bourgeoisie that was very different from the royal and nobles' moral at the time. So it took the king of France some 50 or 100 years to realize that he had been fooled, and after that they of course destroyed this labyrinth immediately. Modern society has acquired much of the labyrinthic perspective. The project to the right is a Dutch project from the 50s, and actually it follows very much the old tribal city way of organizing the space, because to find to each point you actually must have an algorithm or you must have a manual for how to orient. Otherwise you cannot simply orient in this kind of environment. And American suburbia is of course another case. Then we have the last one, that's the panopticon, and it's in a way the central or the linear perspective that you can see only in one way. It was developed by Jeremy Bentham, the philosopher who made an ideal scheme for the prison. And the guard would be sitting in the middle, and he could see all the prisoners in the cells because they were against the light, but he himself was sitting in dark and he could not be seen by the prisoners. So it's quite another thing than the Karlsruhe Markgraf, who was sitting in the middle and could be seen by everybody. Concurrent in the concurrent panopticons, we have a whole variety of devices that actually fulfill the same way of one-way control. We have electronic surveillance, positioning systems based on your mobile, everybody, you can be detected, your position. We have aerial surveillance, we have surveillance of social networks, for instance, Facebook. We have data mining that is so extensive that those who are interested in you know more about you than you know yourself. That's quite a standard. So in conclusion, I would say that we can differ the different perspectives according to do we see or do we not see, are we seen and are we not seen. And by combining these things, we can establish the value perspective, the labyrinth, the linear perspective, and panoptical. Now, there seems to be actually a historical path that stretches from the value perspective to the present day applications of the panoptical. But I think all four of these perspective ways of relating to the environment are still valid and used actually. But maybe there is this kind of history. We like to see history as something moving on. So everything seems then to match the way we perceive, the way we visualize, the way we orientate, and the way we control. And placed into space, maybe with the advent of the linear perspective, but they are still interwoven today. And nowadays we have to operate with algorithms and being subject to surveillance. And orientation in terms of orienting yourself visually has almost lost its meaning. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions, comments to one of the two speakers of this panel? Nobody has anything to say. Actually, I have a question to Professor Benz. You mentioned that when looking at pictures before the Renaissance, they were generally viewed from right to left. But how can we be sure about that? How can we determine that? Very often when I think, for instance, of, let's say, Egyptian or Assyrian art, for instance, we often actually have mirror images, let's say, on both sides of an entrance, for instance. So how do we know whether it has to be viewed from right rather than from left?
Well, first, the change from reading from right to left to starting to read from left to right is supposed to be associated with the introduction of printing books. That means that people started to read much more than before and changing their habits thereby. But of course, when you say how do we know it, it's a very relevant question because really how do we know it? And the art historians say they know it because they study how you expose the most important things in a picture. They are always exposed in the way that you, first of all, you look at the most important part of the picture. So if the most important figures in religious pictures, for instance, change from the right side to the left side, then you can probably imagine that there has taken place a change in the reading of the picture.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have a question for Kurt regarding the two books you're looking at. I'm just wondering, why did you set these two texts specifically in conversation with each other, or you're trying to compare them? And the other one, I was intrigued by I think you said is Islamic of the Muslim Kingdom, was it?
Mamlakat al-Islam?
Mamlakat al-Islam.
So what's the question about that?
No, in terms of, you said that you weren't reading it politically, but I'm just curious about, what were the keys in those texts that led you to that conclusion? Because I think it has a lot of significance, especially in contemporary discourse. Thank you very much.
The choice of these two authors, of course there would have been many alternatives. I just had to reduce myself to two authors. And as I said, both of them are hallmarks of the learning of their period. Al-Muqaddasi is the latest of the so-called, one of the latest of the so-called classical authors. And in Islamic studies, we do suffer still from these classicist views of the literary tradition. For a long time, until today, I think, the so-called post-classical, or as I put it, the Middle Islamic literature is devalued and is not really rated as the original literature that is worth being studied and analyzed. So basically, I had to choose one classical author, which is where there's no criticism in him, and one of the laters. And also, I put Yaqut precisely for the reason that he is an author that is. He's used by every researcher, and he was also used by source authors after his time. So he's used, everybody knows him, everybody uses him, and they use him as a quarry. You just go to the work, you look up the article, and you take what you think you need from it. In fact, it's a work that is not read as a work. Well, it's difficult to read 3,800 pages. It takes years to do so. It more or less is a corpus of knowledge, and not so much a book in the conventional classical sense. This is what makes it particularly interesting. I could have chosen Sadiq al-Afsar, Sar of Omari, which is larger even, but which we only, now there is now printed edition. It's difficult to use still. Yaqut is, I find it a good example because many people know it, everybody, every historian works with it. And so the gap is obvious. We do not really know the work, and in fact, the peak of scholarly study of Yaqut's Mujam al-Budan is before 1900. Since then, nobody really cares for it. Everybody picks bits and pieces of information, but we do not conceive the work as something which is conceptual, which has been composed, which is worth reading crisscross across the articles. I think that it's a whole, it's a mind for much more than just factual information or geo-reference information, but on how spaces are conceived. Second question, the Mamlakat al-Islam. To be honest, I was astonished to find that term book. I do not find it in any other geographic work. I find it's a peculiar expression of al-Muqaddasi. It is not at all related to the legal convention, traditional legal meaning of Dar al-Islam. I don't know any. If you know any use of the word in other contexts, I would be happy to learn about that. I I find this something peculiar, something which must have stood out for the contemporary reader from other conceptions. Well, my interpretation was that it can be translated as an Islamic metonymy, something which is conceived by Muqaddasi originally, and not so much by other authors.
Thank you. Can I just ask as a follow-up to that question, can you tell us a little more in terms of the status of those two texts as examples? So how characteristic are they in relation to other examples of people writing about or conceiving space in a similar way? And in relation to Professor Ben's argument, what was the second layered on the first, or was it, as it were, substituted for the first, so that we have a progressive narrative, and we have a layer, a doubling, and then, as it were, as in the case of perspective, so as it were, other things added, but actually the first not taken away?
Let's start with the second question first. It is not, the model of Buddha is not modeled on the Arts and Humanities, which has to do with the sort of arrangement they both choose. Yaqut is quite concerned with stating his sources. Not every time, but he's conscious, he's aware of this issue. He claims a very strict scholarship in his prolegomena, which is something that is common to geographic authors. Geographic authors seem to tend to state that they reinvent, say, scientific ethic to the field. Nevertheless, Yaqut is quite precise, stating his authors not on every page, but every now and then. And also there is a study before 1900 on the sources in German language, on the sources of Yaqut, and it's a nice book of 100 pages, which is complete with information. The same is not true of Muqaddasi. So while nobody I think is able to really trace down every bit of information in Yaqut, and the parents believe that Muqaddasi is in it, I have no real, not so much evidence of it. The first question, please, that was on how if they are representative. I can talk long about how they are representative of their period in terms of formal arrangement, say itinerary style of Muqaddasi. He's organizing these regional chapters along itineraries. If you go from there to there, you pass by these stations, these are the distances, and this is the produce of every town, and so on. He is representative for that, while on the other hand, Yaqut, in fact, is one of the many encyclopedic authors. Just that not so many authors have chosen the dictionary style. Akvi is the first one, the first prominent one, Omari is one, but he's really the most strictest one. In fact, I could talk long on that, which nobody can stand, but I think the more important point is that we do not have a history of Arabic geography. There is the Russian language word of Kachkovsky, and it's translated into Arabic. It has not been taken into account so much by Western scholars, neither the Russian nor the Arabic word. And since the original was written in the very early in the 20th century, we do lack a modern sort of history of Arabic geography that takes into account many vexations that we now know, how knowledge is made, how knowledge influences the agency, how landscapes are man-made, something which is inconceivable about 1900. And there's very few scholars. I just want to mention Jean-Charles Hussein in Brussels and Paris, who is editing in a very good, in a perfect manner, geographic sources. We have a lot of whole array of geographic sources unprinted, or printed in bad editions that need reprinting. So basically, I want to answer the question like, I do not really know how it is like, how much they are representative of the production of the period. because so little work has been done on this part of history science.
Any further questions or comments?
Yes, I have a question for Kristen. What I'm wondering is, what does it mean to focus on vision as opposed to our other senses? Vision, some people have suggested, is something that distances us in a way that a tactile sense or smelling or hearing doesn't. Can you imagine a different way of looking at the world or at these periods if we had taken these into consideration?
I'm quite sure I understood very well what you want me to answer, but I'm trying. According to Elizabeth, when she is speaking about the historical ways of seeing, she claims that the way of seeing in screens is a more instant way of understanding the environment than relating to the horizontal plane. And because when you relate your seeing to the horizontal plane, you apply a calculation machine, you start to figure out the dimensions and the distances of various objects in the space and so on. While in this screen way of seeing, they come immediately as one image. I don't know if that was
Yeah, I mean, I guess I was just thinking, one of the other things I didn't mention is kinesthesia. So if you are in a medieval city, or if you're in a labyrinth, and you're moving through it with your body, you know, it's another way of perceiving without being visual. I don't know, I just wonder about, you know, using the visual completely as a way of understanding how things have changed.
Well, of course you are right that all senses are used, and if you go to the internet, you add another set of senses that are not related to our physical ones. So there are, of course, a lot of speculations about these things, but I imagine that my interest for the visual is, of course, related to my profession as an architect. All the architecture has, as you mentioned, a lot of other dimensions, naturally.
Any further comments, questions? One more.
Thank you. A question about the anamorphosis and the labyrinth, at least the Cretan labyrinth, not the maze. It seemed to me that they hold a potential for a kind of rogue visuality. They seem anti-authoritarian. And it seems to me that the way you've included them in your presentation, that perhaps that potential for a kind of anti-authoritarian visuality is lost.
Did I understand you right that you think that the labyrinth as a metaphor is anti-authoritarian?
Yeah, not the maze, the
Yes.
recursal Cretan labyrinth, and especially anamorphosis, at least the myth that I know that, I mean, was a kind of a learned play with the rules of identity and perspective, but it really displaces the viewer, it plays tricks on the mind. Galileo called it perverse, right?
for the sake of discussion, I could say that I have just the opposite view to you about labyrinths. That I think it must be the most authoritarian way of directing people, because it's just one tunnel that you have to or go through. So, and the labyrinth proper, that is. So I would say that modern townscape as designed as a labyrinth is actually, it reduces possible choices to a minimum, because you always have to try to find the shortest way, and there is only one shortest way, and there are no options actually. So in a way it shows the very authoritarian organization of modern governance. Of course there are many other reasons for it. One is that nowadays cities are produced in a totally other way than the orthodox or historical cities, with small plots and so on. But this is another thing I won't go into now.
Okay. Okay.
Krista, my question is part of what you said, especially the transparencies of the bank and so on, of course remind me of Foucault's The Order of Things, and much of what he writes on, say, the directions of views. For example, in which picture is he analyzing at the beginning? Is it Goya? Las Maninas, exactly. So who is looking at whom, and what's the directions and the channels of viewing and so on. There's a whole lot of literature on that now, but all of that on European, or say, largely Western cultures, I presume. Is there something, do you know something which special pertinence to Islamic tradition of building or arts? Have view axes been analyzed for Islamic architecture, for example, or for designing landscapes?
I don't think so, because the traditional Islamic landscape, and especially townscape, was deliberately not authoritarian in the sense that they would, or centralized. It was not based on centralized government. So it's even claimed that until the 20th century there were big cities in the Islamic world that had no city government even in the city. They were, the whole organization of the city was on a tribal basis, on a kinship basis organized. And this was broken down hierarchically, so there was simply no need for the panopticon. What you had to control was always close to you, so you did not have to apply the principle of panopticon.
I'm intrigued by the presentation, but I'm a bit suspicious. I mean, does it really apply to the Middle East? Many of these notions are so specifically rooted in their respective cultures that I think it would be worthwhile to look how is it in Islamicate, let's say Islamicate, in Islamicate contexts. Also, the discussion of the so-called Islamic city has much changed during the last decades, and I wonder really whether it is still the state of the art to assume that we can read from the layout of streets and alleys how community has been organized and what are the social implications. I know these approaches, and they have been very valuable because these things have come into consideration at all. I have the impression things have been grown more complex than just saying that's the Islamic type of city.
No, I agree that the concept Islamic city is not a good one. definitely. So that is to speak about.
But I realize it. There's each.
Yes. Well, you actually the physical pattern you find in excavations of wood already. So it's a more than 5,000-year-old tradition that continues in the Islamic world, while it stopped to, I mean, in the 7th or 6th century BC, it ended in ancient Greece, for instance. But the basis of this is not religious, it's the organization of society according to kinship. And on a general level, this theory makes very much actually sense, because a tribal society can be thought of being organized hierarchically. On the top you have an ethnic group, then you have a tribe, then you have a clan, then you have a kinship group, lineage, extended family, and so on. And each of these levels are introvert. They mind their own business. They are independent of the other levels except for organizing certain things in society. And it's amazing how this social pattern is directly, logically visible in the way the physical environmental structure is designed. Not necessarily designed in the way it's better to say built up, because there was probably no pre-plans, design plans before for speed.
Just one final comment before we have to break. There's a very interesting book by Hans Belting called Florence and Baghdad, where he develops the argument of the study of optics and geometry. So why is geometry, the study of geometry in Haytham in the Islamic tradition lead to in one direction, and why does it lead to perspective, perspective vision in the Western tradition? So it's a useful book to look at. It compares perspective in painting, and then it compares the mashahiyya, or the mode of perception presupposed by the geometric pattern, and the mode of perception presupposed by the perspective. In one case, geometry is used to geometrize space, and the other geometry is used to understand vision, but not to geometrize space. So it's an interesting book to look at in comparative arts.
Okay, no more comments. So we just have to stay within the topic of the conference a little bit more, because I was told to remind you of the conference dinner this evening. We meet at 8 o'clock. The place is called L'Autre Bistro, and the spatial location is very close to AUB. You leave AUB through the main gate on Upper Campus. You all know where that is?
Yes.
Yes, okay. Then you basically turn right, go along Bliss Street for approximately 20-25 meters, take the first turn left, that is Jeanne d'Arc Street, go up to the first crossroad, and there on the left corner you will find L'Autre Bistro. It's one of the more beautiful old houses, just a 2-story building, so it should be easy to spot that. Yeah, that's it. Thank you.